Hello and welcome to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com, a new podcast where we bring you news, insight and analysis on that most important of the least important things, football. I'm Duncan Castles and I'm joined this week by a very special guest, an individual who's taken a key role in the evolution of football's transfer market as head of international scouts at Chelsea Football Club, and someone who's now at the coalface of the sport's move to multi-club ownership as the head of football for Global Football Holdings. Welcome to the Transfers podcast, Scott McLachlan.
Good afternoon, Duncan. Thank you for the invitation. I've been a long-time listener to this wonderful podcast, and I hope I can add value for your listeners. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us, and thanks for listening to the podcast. And as a long-term listener to the podcast, you know we always like to open with some market news. So before we go into what I know will be fascinating detail of your own work at various football clubs, bring the listeners some news about Paris Saint-Germain and one of the top midfielders in European football at present, who is Vitinha, selected for the Ligue 1 and Champions League teams of the year in the past season, 40 appearances in those two competitions with 9 goals and 5 assists. Paris Saint-Germain have opened talks about extending the 24-year-old's contract. He was signed in 2022 from Porto, taken for his release clause value of 41.5 million euros. Had just been voted Portugal's Young Player of the Year in the previous season. He is extremely well valued by Luis Enrique, the coach, who called him PSG's Player of the Season, talked about him being a player who's perfectly suited to our playing philosophy, to our expectations, to the qualities that a midfielder must have. Enrique said he's a player with unlimited energy, plays every minute of the matches, and he wants to train with those who have not played after the games. I've been told that amongst his many admirers in the European game is Manchester City manager Pep Guardiola, who considers him to be almost unique at the top level of the European game and being able to excel 3 central midfield positions as a number 6 and a box-to-box number 8 and as a playmaking number 10. He actually spent a season on loan in the Premier League in 2020 to 2021 at Wolves. Did not start many games for Wolves. They had an option to buy at 20 million euros, which they didn't take up after that season. I remember when I heard that he was moving with an option that high, it did seem high to me as a journalistic observer, and I wasn't surprised when they didn't take it up. But Scott, that looks like a lost opportunity now on Wolves' part.
Yes, perhaps it does. He's made a notable number of appearances for PSG, and I think in a squad stacked with the talent that has been over that period, to play 64 League games is evidence of his importance to the group in relation to the Manchester City interest. I think, as you say, playing 3 versions of a central midfield role and being such a quality all-rounder, and Rodri being 28, maybe Manchester City, as they do, are looking for the next successor. The search for talent is perpetual in that level of club, and he's clearly coveted by PSG and many admirers around the European game.
Indeed, and made himself a starter for the Portuguese national team, probably one of the most talented Portuguese squads that the country's ever had. From Vitinha's sparkling career on the pitches of European football, let's switch our focus to your highly successful career and describe it as the engine room of the European game. Among the titles Scott has won are 2 Champions Leagues, 2 Europa Leagues, 2 Premier League titles, 2 FA Cups, a League Cup and a FIFA Club World Cup. I think of him as something of a conscious chameleon, changing his role in the game while he's ridden multiple waves of innovation in professional football, progressing through 3 decades, I think, in the sport. Scott, let's start by going back to the 1990s when you were at Wimbledon Football Club. And on top of your duties coaching the youth teams there, you got involved in performance analysis, which is basically the forerunner of the detailed player performance statistics and analytics that have become a fundamental part of today's game in recruitment, scouting, opposition analysis, and I think also for spectators these days. Can you tell us how that came about at Wimbledon?
Of course. Thank you for dating me, going back to the 1990s. People will better figure out my age. Listeners will understand that football in the 1990s was a very different domain to where we are today. The number of staff around the first teams was far smaller, and the number of first team jobs around a football club were equally as small.
Yeah.
So as an ambitious coach, initially was my passion, to achieve a role that offered full-time status was very, very difficult. In those days, the under-18 coach role was the first full-time position. So I was eager to be in the business, and I was looking for a differentiator that would see me, as you say, be chameleon-esque and make myself more viable for a role if ever a role came up. And I'd enrolled in a sports science degree at South Bank University, a master's degree, and a huge part of that particular degree was performance analysis. And I started to read the seminal work of Reap and Benjamin in relation to football and other sports, was guided by Keith Lyons at Cardiff Met, who was a huge figure in the analysis world of sport in general, particularly at Olympic sports. And then, by pure chance, Egil Olsen arrived at Wimbledon in season 99 to be the new manager at Wimbledon. And this story is quite well known. I would stand outside the door every Monday when I took the under-9s kit back to the laundry at the training ground and asked Egil if I could have a job, because I claimed to know analysis. It was a bit of a leap of faith, but I was very, very aware of Egil's work. And for those in the audience who aren't, Egil is humble, honest, and almost written out of the history books of analysis, quite frankly, which disappoints me somewhat, because this man was a true pioneer of performance analysis and analytics. As coach of Norway, his team, using his analysis software and insight, only conceded 2 open play goals in 3 seasons and managed to beat Brazil twice in 1998 and took them to a really high ranking in the FIFA rankings. He's one of the only people I know at that time who was able to take his analytical findings and integrate that with coaching philosophy, game theory, and the principles on the grass of how to get the teams to behave based on analytics. Sadly, for him, it was function over form, let's say, the style he coveted. And I found a famous quote just this week reading about it, that when Norway beat Scotland in the late 90s, one of your peers wrote that it was like watching a one-trick pony beat a no-trick pony. So I'm not sure what that says about the Scottish national team at the time, but he came and tried to influence Wimbledon in a similar way to that which he'd done with the Norwegian team. And quite frankly, as a participant and a very willing observer of how he tried to build that relationship, I think there was a bit of a cultural mismatch with Egil and what was at the time the second evolution of the crazy gang. And people will remember that ultimately he lost his job in the second half of the season. But he'd tutored me and mentored me through that season to really understand the practical application of analysis. And ultimately the following season, when Terry Burton was made manager, another one of my mentors I'm very grateful to, we actually formed a permanent performance analysis department thereafter. So Egil was truly a pioneer for us at that particular time.
So what kind of data and what kind of software? I presume Olsen had a bespoke software system that he was using. Were you employing to do these analytics? What were you focusing on, and how were you using it to benefit the team?
Egil had been working with the Norwegian Sports Science Institute at the time, which for a long time was one of the preeminent sports science departments. They'd also done a lot of work on actual physiological testing of players as well as the analysis thing. They were probably at that time Norway was one of the forerunners in this domain. He designed the Master Coach software along with support from the university, which at that time was a standalone unique piece of software, and it aggregated defensive and offensive movements on and off the ball to give the player a score. It involved looking at every single clip of a player, and Mondays and Tuesdays were long days for the players at that time because every player had a one-on-one individual meeting with the coach.
Okay.
I started as the sorcerer's apprentice, we should say, just simply cutting the video, etc., and taking time to learn the definitions and the visual expression of the game, that to make sure we were coding it as closely as possible from his eyes to my eyes. So that at the time was known as observer reliability. So we were making sure that I was within a threshold of observation that would see the results be accurate. And once I built trust, I was allowed to have individual meetings with the players myself, which would free him up to do other important tasks during the week. And it was a really, really remarkable schooling at that particular time. I did it voluntarily and happily because I cherished being around somebody who was such a deep thinker about the game and somebody who was happy to be a disruptor in the game. And maybe that's a trait that I've continued from those days onwards, actually, to look at things differently and be curious and analytical.
So to give a concrete example, if you were coding and placing a score on a centre back, what actions on the field would you be looking at and scoring?
There was distances to players was a scoring, forward passes. Egil's and the Norwegian school of football at the time was very much based on the shortest number of passes to goal. In fact, he was very influenced by Rupert Benjamin's 1968 paper, Skill and Chance in Football, which is still very applicable to them, maybe less so to the modern game now, but up to very recent it was still applicable, that most goals scored are with 4 or less passes. So Egil's philosophy was based on balance or imbalance of an opponent's defence, and to recognise those situations. An imbalanced defence attack directly through, a balanced defence play long over the top. So players were measured on their decision making and execution of either of those two attacking methodologies.
And you would use the same coding and software system to analyse the opposition?
At that time, Egil was doing traditional scouting methods to analyse the opposition, which was a place where analysis was at that time. The time it took to do that work, if you can imagine, in those days, with limited technology, that was a 2.5 day process every single week. So
on your own team, 2.5 days just to do your own team for one match.
So for one match, 2.5 days to code it, etc., and then obviously have the meetings with the players. So that limits your microcycle of a week. Careful planning of that particular week's training, and to do that, we had tactical observers for the opponents in those reports we used to build the model. But Egil's model was, I would say from experience, wasn't necessarily focused too much on the opponent, because there was only 2 settings you had to really worry about at the time, which was whether they balanced or imbalanced. Where we won the ball and how high you won the ball kind of dictated what your next step was. It didn't have to be too nuanced because it was based on the zonal movement of all of the players around the pitch to win the ball back.
Okay. And as you then went on to work at Northampton Town and Southampton, and then opposition scouting came into in effect during that period?
Yes. Yeah, I think the biggest change, we have to remember here, a small history lesson. We have to remember here in the late 90s, technology was really, really limited and was analog. So you were using VHS cassettes and then kind of early 2000s you were using DVD, and obviously now everything's live streamed and streamed in digital. Okay, so that's also a limiting factor, was the technology limitations dictated how quickly and in what format you can actually use your work. So on Eggles' departure, Wimbledon were, I think, the second club in the UK, alongside Sam Allardyce and Bolton Wanderers and Paul Balsam, to take sports text product, Sports Code, which is still a very, very prominent software package in the game now. And that allowed you to code live and allowed you to be far more flexible with the codings and the definitions you used for your analysis of your athletes. And it really kind of revolutionized how we did it, because it was a product that was far more flexible than Eggles' Master Coach at the time, far more transportable. It was laptop based, which the other system wasn't. And I think one of the changes I'd learned from Eggles was there's still a very large human element into how you translate data and present data to players. And I think one of the key learnings I'd had was, as I said at the start, the cultural match between how you do your analysis work and how you interact with your players is really critical, how you present it. So one of the first things I did with the new software was its portability allowed us to put that product in the player's domain. So we would put rushes, as I think media people call them, on the television screen in the canteen days after games. So it was just on a rotation on a screen so people could see it subliminally. You positioned yourself in social settings around players, so you were in their circle rather than them having to come to a unique room for a one-on-one meeting. And those simple examples really show you how far performance analysis has travelled and how it's become such an integral part of the modern weekly cycle of a team's preparation for a game and an individual's preparation. Both of us will know of the recent example that's well written about now of Kevin De Bruyne using data and analytics to actually support his contract negotiation. I think that's a really great example of how, from the late 90s, how the analysis world has spread to be impactful across all manner of aspects of the business.
I think that's a good way to move on to the next stage of your career, where you were hired by Fulham in January 2009 to, I think, bring these kind of techniques into the talent identification process, into the process of assessing which players should be brought to a club and also, I presume, which players should be moved out of a club.
Yes, that was Fulham at the time was a super interesting place to work, not only in football aspects but also culturally. At that particular time it was owned by Mr. Al Fayed, the owner of Harrods, and culturally it was the most wonderful place to work. A lot of the cultural dynamics have been transferred from Harrods into Fulham. They had one of the best onboarding systems of a staff member I've ever seen to date.
Okay.
It was a real community feel. It was unique at the time in that the whole of the business was on one site. I've worked at other clubs since where football is locked away behind gates and big fir trees, and the commercial and the marketing and the HR are somewhere else. I think there was a connectivity and a togetherness built from the club being on one particular site. I've been very fortunate, Duncan, in my journey, that each of the roles I've had have come through a previous relationship or network in some shape or form. So this particular role, I benefited from a relationship with Barry Simmons, who was the chief scout, who we'd taken our coaching badges maybe a decade before at the Douglas Air Sports Centre with Les Reed, who's another well-known name in the business, as our tutor. And Barry reached out and explained that Fulham were looking to merge analysis and recruitment. This was kind of a Moneyball-esque move by Fulham. If you remember, the book came out in 2003 and the film in 2011, and I think the first wave of curious analysts had jumped on the idea when the book was published, and then the film maybe brought a second wave of analysts into, could we be the next Oakland A's of the world in the football domain? And Fulham, one of Fulham's primary values at the time was to be pioneers and to take the brave step of having a technical scout and work to merge data and the traditional scouting methods was insightful from Fulham at that particular time, which was interesting. So we sought to develop a methodology that blended the qualitative and quantitative elements of traditional talent ID. The integration of scouting intelligence and performance data was really probably in its infancy. People were comfortable around teams, as I'd been at Wimbledon, but people had really viewed the two as separate disciplines because scouts weren't terribly data literate at that particular time. I think scouting was seen as an art rather than a science at that particular time, and we were determined to change that. Finding sources for your data and data sets, etc., was really quite challenging at that particular time. I was very much influenced at the time by Raphael Poli of the CIES Institute. He, relatively shortly before my entry to Fulham, was building the CIES Institute and all the research around the player labour market. So he informed my understanding and broadened my understanding of the player labour market, player trade routes, optimal age thresholds, optimal length of service of successful teams, squad demographics, player development hub countries, etc. And Raphael has gone on to inform a huge amount of research across a broad range of topics about how players move around the game, what's successful. And his work initially really informed our strategy for how we're going to intertwine traditional scouting with this data-led scouting. And supplementary to that, we were very fortunate. The analysis department, led by Andy Scolding, who's now working at Tottenham Hotspur, was open to supporting that particular work. So we had the performance analysis, which I'd known previously, scouting, and then data together as a triangle working to inform recruitment decisions for the chief scout.
A lot of mentions of important people in football. CIS website, something we refer to a lot on this podcast, and something I'd urge all listeners who are interested in the detail of football to delve into. Andy Scolding, I know from my own time working at Fulham, a brief period editing the club's publications there, and I completely hear you when you're talking about the joy of that training ground with everyone being on the same site and the ability to interact with everyone in the football club. At the same time, Andy Scolding went on to Liverpool and England, and as you say now at Tottenham Hotspur. Scott, tell us about the strategy. You mentioned the strategy and developing a strategy there. What exactly was that first strategy you put together to improve the recruitment of Fulham Football Club using these kind of new sources of data in a scouting context?
Duncan, it was at the start, it was really terribly basic. We had to actually build a framework. It was how we're going to build a framework to actually leverage the information we were gathering. So at the very start, on my first day, I recall that I asked for the archive of reports, thinking they would be on some form of laptop and a digital interface. And we opened a cupboard, and there was the paperwork reports of the previous 2 years or 3 years or whatever. So things had been done in paper form up to that point. So my first role, we'd taken a software package from Ireland, which was a scouting package. And really my first task was very rudimentary, and that was to load the archive on, because this was information that could inform decisions, because it had been work diligently performed by the team of scouts that Fulham had at that time. So it would allow us to build a database and inform some of the decisions. The next thing, we worked with Roy Hodgson at the time and his coaching staff, and Barry, the chief scout, to put together profiles of players and then a scoring system, and 2 or 3 different types of report which scouts could do.
So
And then-
profiles of players that the club would want to sign.
Positional profiles. Yeah, positional profiles. And that was supplemented by where was the inefficiencies where we could particularly find value in the market.
Okay.
Fulham at that time, they'd had the Tigana spell where they'd spent big money, but obviously the voracious appetite for signing players. Fulham was probably ranked 13 or 14th for its player budget at the time in the Premier League between 2009 and 2011 when I was there. So we were still seeking economies and efficiency in the spend, and to perform higher than the budget. So we sought what we termed at the time the 3 R's, and then we used data to support and forecast whether the players that we considered 3 R's would be beneficial to us. And the 3 R's were rejects. So who are the players on the edge of other people's squads who aren't getting time at that particular moment that might be open to a move? Rehabs, where were players that had injury absences? We had an unbelievable sports science and sports med department at Fulham at the time, led by Mark Taylor, who'd been at Bolton Wanderers working for Sam Allardyce previously. And we had full faith that that department could rehab and get a player on the pitch and exceed the minutes that they'd had previously. So players with an injury record didn't scare us. We believe we could take them and get them back on the pitch. If I give a finite example of that, Damien Duff came. I think he'd had some ankle problems over a long period of time, and the department rehabilitated him, gave him prehab and preventative protocols, and he played nearly a whole season and took the team to the European final in 2009-10. So that was a great example. And we also saw Reinvents, players that we saw value in, and a competency framework in one position that we felt we could transpose that into a different position in our team and give them an uplift. So probably the greatest example at that time in there would be Moussa Dembele, who came and joined us from RZ. And we played him as an 8-10 at the time, and then he went to Spurs and became a wonderful 6 after that. So there were some pretty good examples where we made it work for us over that period of time, by looking around the edges for the inefficiencies in the market to help us.
Which is very much a Moneyball inspired approach.
Yeah, and also the other part I need to mention there, Duncan, I think was quite important, is also knowing when the player comes in and analysing what the value is. So I remember we were able to calculate using the data because Roy had a very, very specific style, as you know. Okay, Roy at the time played a 4-2-2-2 tactical system at that particular time. And this is where it linked together, using the analysis of Andy Scolding and Martin Foyston and the team there, we knew what the team actually did every day in the Premier Leagues. And it seems really obvious now to every analyst listening that you would then go out and shop for exactly the same thing. But we drilled down really deeply into what that was analytically and data-wise. So we knew how many chances Andrew Johnson or Clint Dempsey would get on a given week. So then you would go to the market and find players that had the same efficiency rating and level in the market. So you were being really, really prescriptive and specific when the scouts went out to look for something. That was a big change.
Very, very targeted in
yes,
picking particular types of players and players in particular conditions that you could get a value increase for the whole club.
Yeah, there's a case actually. We tried to sign a player that had a rehabilitation issue, and we wanted to get the team to be higher up the pitch in certain periods of the game, because the Premier League was terribly competitive, as you know, and we were actually scouting people whose frequency of free kick earning was higher than others in the league. and to win set pieces in certain areas of the field that would allow us to play to them to get our team up the pitch.
Sometimes described by certain English papers as divers.
I think it's a more nuanced skill than that.
I agree. And who was targeted as the best free kick winners that were suited to Fulham?
This name might shock a few people, but at that particular time, Mark Viduka was on our list.
Okay.
As an ability to be a reference striker,
yes,
to take the ball in certain areas and draw fouls or win set pieces for your team around an area. He in his time in his career, he was remarkable at that as a player.
So people took notice of this very quickly because you were only at Fulham, I think, for 18 months. Is that correct? Before Michael Emenalo brought you to Chelsea to implement something very similar there, to professionalise the scouting of one of the world's most important clubs.
Yeah, I did. I think I was 2.5 years at Fulham, joined in Christmas and left in the summer of 2011. I was very, very disbelieving when I had a phone call from a very, very long-standing friend from the Wimbledon days saying he recommended me for this position because I thought that was beyond my level of competency, if I'm being really reflective and honest with myself at that particular time. But the role and the excitement of the role allowed me to realise two career objectives. One, obviously every single person who works in the business, or the majority of the people who work in this business, are terribly aspirational. You know, there's a stronger competition off the grass as there is on it to reach the top.
Yep.
So the opportunity to work at the very highest level of the game was important. But I was also at a point, having done a huge variety of roles on my journey up till 2011, academy coach, community coach, performance analyst, opposition scout, technical scout. I was at a point in my career where I really wanted to harness that learning and that experience and to have a real purpose in my work, and maybe have a purpose that was over and above that individual role at the club. For the sake of the game, let's say, a sort of altruistic ambition. I think previously football had generally underappreciated scouting and scouts. It was a role that was performed remotely and discreetly by knowledgeable fans, retired coaches or ex-players. A fraternity who boasted of late nights, number of grounds visited and the number of starts at their player, or the recognition of one of their players being signed. And I increasingly felt that this wonderful fraternity of people who were doing this for expenses on mileage and a cup of tea and a small sandwich all up and down the UK and even abroad, these people are now informing multi-million-pound acquisitions of Premier League clubs. And I started to wonder and be baffled by what was the competency required to inform that decision. What qualifications do you need? Do you have to have played the game to be good at this role? Does experience solely make you an elite scout? Because there's a whole range of inherent biases in the process of gathering that experience. And what competencies could we identify and then develop to perform this role in a professional way? And that became really quite quickly my passion, and I became a zealot for the professionalisation of scouting over 10 years at Chelsea, and that energy and desire to improve it, I hope, and I believe, I do believe that we contributed and improved scouting not only for Chelsea but perhaps for the game and for the people who wish to be a scout in the future.
So go through the elements that needed to be added to or accentuated within that scouting fraternity to professionalise and to make the scouting process more efficient and effective?
There is a huge list of items we did, because 11 years is a really, really long time in a football club, and it's a ridiculously long time at a club of that size to be responsible for that journey over that period of time, firstly. So when we joined in 2011, Michael Emanalo became the technical director and Frank Arneson was leaving. So very, very similar to Fulham, the first thing we did was look at the scouting team itself. Who were they? What were their experiences? What were their skill sets? Some of those people chose to leave, and we very quickly had to. I think we replaced approximately 40% of the team. I think one of the first changes we made was a huge cultural change in the scouting department. I very much like to work collaboratively. I don't claim to know the answer to every single question. At the time, the business had treated scouts, as I said, remotely and kept them away at arm's length. I think that the business was, we respect your scouting report, thanks for the information, but, very rarely came to games, very rarely close to the club hub. And that, I think, if you look at that on a human level, scouts become lone wolves in that way, Duncan. You either become very questioning of your ability to judge a player, or you become the other end of the spectrum, is you become really, really a firm believer in what you see is always right. So what we needed to do was change, and the outcome of that is that their only currency was, what I experienced was, their currency was getting a player signed meant you were a good scout.
Yeah.
But I wanted to change that because I felt, I quickly analysed that Chelsea would sign at that time, you would maybe sign 2 or 3 players a window, no more than that at the time. So we're working 360 something days a year to sign 3 players. So how many of your 20 scouts, which was probably the size of the team in those days, across youth and senior, how many of those are going to feel the glory of signing a player? So I was thinking psychologically about this, thinking, right, where's the fulfillment for a scout if that's the only measure of the quality of your work is signing a player? There's so many variables you're not in control of as a scout at that point. So the biggest change we made was we turned it 180 degrees and pivoted, and we said, look, your product, the product of your work isn't a player, be it wearing the blue shirt at Stamford Bridge. Your day-to-day product is actually the quality of the intelligence you gather, and we're going to work with you to grow the skills required to be better than ever at gathering that intelligence and using that intelligence to inform our player acquisition decisions. And that included bringing forward my use of data and technical scouting, etc., into this domain. And that ultimately means that there's an evolution in your team, because some people are going to say, yeah, great, that's for me, I can do that, I can join this journey. And other people at the time were quite happy that maybe they didn't want to work in that particular way that we were proposing to them.
So how much of the reform system was based on collecting data, and how much was the eye test, something you kind of alluded to earlier, the idea that only former footballers would be able to assess whether someone was good enough to perform for a club like Chelsea?
It was a mix of the two, because it has to be a mix of the two. And I think if I jump forward to the present day, I think a big piece that's missing and is really difficult to quantify, and I think it's where the real beauty still lies in the scouting process, is there'll always have to be a human piece in the scouting process. Data can lead you to the right markets, shrink the population of players you have to look at, inform what the outcome will be when the guy comes to your club. It can simulate what that will be really quite accurately nowadays, etc. It can also help you inform injury risk potential, etc. But at the end of the day, we're putting a human being from one tribe into our tribe, and the nuance, the emotion, the connection and the feelings of dealing with a human being is really at the core of sport, right? And that's where the beauty of the purest view of sport lies. It's a communal pursuit of excellent sport in its truest form, and we've seen that in the Olympics recently. And football is still that: 11 guys on a field trying to connect and work cohesively and fluidly for 90 minutes to achieve a performance outcome. So there still always will be a huge, for me, there'll always be a huge human element. We developed a B2C relationship with the club as a scouting department. We wanted to see the club as our client as such, and I think that gave us a professional attitude and vision of how we actually interacted with the club as a scouting department and as remote workers. It was a really, really big part of our mindset, so that we understood that everything we did was through this customer dynamic. So our reports, etc., our status reporting, our summaries of players, how we presented the data, was all. We spent a great deal of time researching how to present your data visualizations the best way. How do you actually write a report? If you look at this at face value, the scout in South America will be in London 2 or 3 times a year. So the sole visibility for his work is the scouting report. So we taught people how to write an impactful report. We used a lot of journalistic skills in that. How you write a report, the language you use, spacing of it, tone of it. We took a deep dive into how to write better business reports and executive summaries. For people, it's just one aspect of the deep work that we did. We continued the work or revised the work of Fulham and made sure that all the reports were archived onto a deep database, which became really, really large. If you can think 11 years of reports, the system became really, really huge. So yeah, it was a real mix of human, because I think there's 3 aspects of a scout's work, 3 basic pillars. You have to be able to assess a player clearly. That's the first thing. Secondly, you need to know the market structure in which you're working. Each of the European countries and South America have different market dynamics, different regulatory framework, different structures, and somewhere in that structure there'll be an advantage that you can have. Okay, so the Argentinian Federation and France have different rules about youth development, terms and lengths of contracts for players. There's different nuances that you can take advantage of. So all of our scouts were tasked with understanding their landscape in great detail. And then obviously you need market insight every single day, because things change in this volatile market day to day, hour to hour. And I know in your role you follow that as keenly as the scouts do. So scouts would have to have a very strong, deep and broad network of people that can inform them of any changes, because the player you like today could have told his ACL in training this morning and now he has to be off your list of primary targets. So they have to be agile in day-to-day data gathering as well. That's where the human aspect's really critical.
You talked about how at Fulham you were targeting specifically to Roy Hodgson's team. That must have been a more complicated process at Chelsea. I think during the 11 years you spent at the club, you had 10 different coaches there. As a professionalised scouting department, how do you prepare for basically an annual change of coach and a change of playing style that can often accompany the change of coach?
Yeah, so over time we evolved. We looked and started scouting coaches so that we knew what was coming in. Because we knew that we had to support the next guy. The coach is, the most important football person, let's say, in relation to the grass every time they come in. The 10 that our department worked for were all very, very interesting, but they all had their own nuances and differences and their own vision of the game. That's where the deep beauty lies, right? Is that every coach has their own vision of the game, from Sarri to Conte to Mourinho to Andre Villaboas and Rafa, etc. Everybody had their own vision of the game. So, we're there to try and support that. But I think one of the changes at the time also was that I think generally in the business over those 10 years, clubs were very cognizant of the money that they were spending every time a new manager came in. And I think one of the changes that Chelsea was a part of at that time was I kind of compare it to the paint chart, was to try to go colour by colour down the paint chart as far as your coaches were concerned, rather than going from black to white, because a change of black to white in the coaching style and personality game model normally would involve a really deep investment and a huge turnover of your players, and all of the supplementary variables that come with a huge turnover of players might impact your performance. So over the 10 years we learned that maybe we need to take a coach that's one or two colours away from the last one and slowly evolve, and continuity was an important aspect of how we do that. And that meant that the scouts had more surety in what their task was and the kind of player they were looking for over a period of time. That's what we tried to do.
And that would be a joint process with Michael Emenalo until he resigned in 2017 and Marina Granovskaya.
Yes, yeah, and obviously Petter when Petter was there as well. So was to identify what's the game model, what kind of players has this coach coveted in his previous places, do we have those players in the squad now, and the ones that we think we might need around the edges from that. And if I can ask a little bit of a cheeky question on that subject, who was the hardest of the coaches you worked with to work with when it came to scouting players and recruitment? I will be remarkably fair to all of them. All of them had their nuances, because you have to very much appreciate, and it was something we spoke about at the scouting level often, was you have to appreciate the pressure these people are under in performing this role. Our job is to mitigate as much risk as possible in any player acquisition on behalf of the club and behalf of the coach. Our job is to make sure that the level of intelligence we've gathered de-risks the acquisition and as much as possible. So all of them had their challenges. I think one of the biggest learnings for me, one of the biggest learnings came really kind of near the end of my time when I realised that Frank Lampard was the first English-speaking coach I'd had in my time up till then, and I wasn't terribly aware of the impact of that until he actually entered the building. And a lot of the other managers, English was their second or third language, and communication is such an important part of the coaching and also the scouting and acquisition process. Being able to speak and use a lexicon that your listener and your audience understand, and to speak passionately about the game still remains a really, really important aspect of the scouting process for me. You can write about it, that's great, but also you want to be in a room at times and speak about the players and bring that player to life for your audience, because in the modern day, the time the coach has to go out and sit in the tribune and watch a player has changed over time. In the 1990s, when I first started, managers would go out on a Tuesday and a Wednesday and watch players they wanted to see or watch the opponent. But I think the time pressure on coaches dictates that that's not possible anymore. I think probably Mr. Moyes was one of the more prominent ones doing it right up till recently, but it wasn't as common as it had been in the past. So that gave the scouts more relevance, quite frankly, but also gave them a huge responsibility to be far more detailed in their analysis and their description of a player, to paint this picture on behalf of all of the people that were in the decision team at that particular time. And speaking to somebody who was a native speaker of English certainly made that a more intuitive, lively discussion than it might have been with some of the others. But that's not to be disrespectful to them. I can imagine if I was speaking to Arrigo Sacchi, who I loved when I was a coach, I'm quite sure I wouldn't be able to communicate in Italian how great I loved the player either.
Definitely avoided by choosing the coach who was easiest to work with rather than telling us about the one who was hardest to work with. Let's move on to, I think, one of the big evolutions that you experienced at Chelsea Football Club, which was when Marina Granovskaya and Michael Emenalo brought in this idea, I think, to combat financial fair play and to retain Chelsea's ability to compete in the transfer market, that they would sign and develop as much young talent as possible, in addition to players they expected to make Chelsea's first team, but also players that they could develop and sell to other clubs for a profit. And it's a model that's been copied by other clubs down the line since Chelsea did it so effectively. But that must have been a huge additional challenge to you as head of scouting, in that, one, you're looking at a lot more players than previously and looking at having to do with due diligence and more deals, because more players were coming into the club. But also you have to chart out a development pathway for all of these additional players, which in Chelsea's case included using loans on I think it's fair to say, on a basis that no other English club had ever tried to use before.
Yeah, that was a really, really interesting time and an interesting development that we had to adapt to quite quickly. It was one of the best examples of collaboration, because the youth department with Neil Bath was also a huge part of that, depending on the age of the player. There's, as you say, there was a range of ages involved in that particular department, and the embryonic stages of that were quite organic and informal, how we followed the players. But we very, very quickly realised that the players on loan were a subset. So we had internal players, loan players, and then external players that all had to be assessed by the scouts. So for the data and the scout observations to be reliable of our loans, we used the senior scout team and the youth scout team to scout the loan players. So we had our scouts scouting our own players in a similar methodology they would do for external players, and then we also grew over a period of time our whole department, player care department, that would also look at the players. As you know, we had some really, really remarkable player mentors with Paulo Ferreira, Eddie Newton, Claude Makaleli, Mark Beanie did goalkeepers. We had a really Christoph Lolisham did goalkeepers at one point as well. So we had a really, really remarkable group of professional mentors that would visit the players, speak to the clubs and their coaches, make sure the player was performing at the level required, and they would track and forecast where they would be on their journey to return back to Chelsea if possible, which seems quite logical. And then supplementary to that, we would have our scouts view them and report as if they were an external target. The reason for that being that our scouts wouldn't know that player, and it would really be an objective assessment of that player in that particular environment, in that particular team. They didn't have a personal relationship the same way the mentor would have done. The mentor was encouraged to have a personal relationship and really dig deep into that particular player to help him on his journey. But our external scouts were encouraged to view him as a normal external target. That way the reporting was far more objective for us.
When you're assessing a player's future development, I mean, this strikes me as one of the hardest parts of scouting. You have this huge amount of analytics at present. You can benchmark players against similar players in different divisions. You can assess what the difficulty of one league is relative to another league, make predictions on the basis of those differences, to say if you take a player from the Netherlands into the Premier League, what level are they likely to perform at against a Premier League player if they sustain at their current level. But generally you're looking for the real gem is to find the player who's not at a top level yet but will be in 2 or 3 years' time. how much of that can you assess from data these days?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest area of development. At the time at Chelsea, I had 5 behaviours I felt were really critical for scouting. The scout pillars, so to speak. So I think, irrespective of the age of player that you're tasked with assessing as a scout, my journey as to date, I think there's 5 skills. You need to be very good in observation. So that observation in itself is a science, as you'll appreciate. I know you're very well read, Duncan. So observation itself is a real science. And I think in football, it's also understanding what you can choose to not see on any given day, because the amount of information and stimulus that a scout takes in at a game is ridiculous anyway. I think 22 players on a pitch gives you over 3,000 data points in 90 minutes. So no human brain can assimilate that level of information. So the skill of observation is really, really important. The way you help that is that you use classification of behaviours. So we spoke earlier about positional profiles, etc. So you have what you think is your blueprint for that position for your team, and you measure people against it. But something I was also very passionate about, to link it back to the data piece, was that scouts needed to use some form of measurement. The scouting fraternity in the past have communicated in jargon, phrases, and immeasurable descriptions like lots, plenty, many, loads, and each of those is different for each of those is different for every listener. Okay. Yeah. And there's also occasions where a few is actually a lot in a certain context. In a Champions League final, a few shots from a player is actually immeasurably big, depending on the context. So, we were pushing scouts to use evidence and record frequency and volume of behaviours at that time. And people's definitions differ, as I say. Then there's the skill of reporting, critical skill for remote workers. Deep skill of how to present your evidence, the narrative, etc., to your audience is really, really important. And we were really passionate, Duncan, at Chelsea, about shrinking the distance from the remote scout to the decision maker, be that Mr. Abramovich, Marina, Petter, Frank Lampard, and all the other coaches. So the way we shrunk the distance was to have high quality reporting, and also to have an open, transparent communication system. So they had full access to everything we did. We didn't only communicate when we met a player of interest, we communicated on a very, very regular basis with them, and we had a schedule and a variety of documents that allowed us to communicate with those people, and they had direct access to our work, and could come with a query if they so wished. And we worked on, to some degree, persuasion.
Okay.
We were trying to plant the nuance of players that we might like sometime into the future through our communication, so that the decision makers and the coaches would become comfortable with that name as we journeyed along the scouting timeline. So you might put a name in that the scouts were starting to follow. We had some documents, we would drop that into the conversation to the decision makers. I feel that would empower the decision maker, because you have to remember that external communications coming into the hub of the club all the time. Executives, coaches, the head coach, all those people receive external communication and recommendations all the time. We felt and were proud to consider ourselves the primary source of scouting information. So we equally had as much an internal sales process as that from the external people, if that makes sense. Okay. And that's where the B2C relationship came in, that we felt we had to justify with strong evidence and data the recommendations we were making. And then we had a whole strategy of how we persuaded the decision makers that this might be the right journey to take. And part of that, to answer your question, finally, I apologise, is this whole area of forecasting is the 5th skill. I think all the others are relatively easy to do for a very experienced scout: observe, classify, measure, and report. But to your point, the really most difficult one is how to forecast. And when we started in 2011 and we queried people about how far into the future they actually thought they could forecast a player's performance, I was astounded by the leap of faith that some people were taking and the bias that supported that when they forecasted. And I think that's inherent across all of the game in the late 90s and early 2000s, that people were slightly misunderstanding of how far into the future they could predict a player. And if you reverse that, and whilst they're nice, and they're nice vox pops and they're nice videos when we see them, but you see these people when a player reaches the top, Jude Bellingham or Jared Bowen or whoever's reached the top recently, there's always somebody who comes on and says, yeah, I knew as soon as I saw him at 9 he was going to be at the World Cup. And if you actually look at that objectively, that's impossible, because I can't tell you what any child at 9 is going to be like when they're 12. In fact, you'd be hard pressed to tell you what they're going to be like at 11 as a football player. So we need to scouting. We were really pushing on this at the time. You have to really change what the horizon is on your forecast, because changing the horizon on the forecast means you can be far more accurate with the forecast, right? Mm-hmm. So that was something we did a lot of work on. Matt Hallam came up with it, I believe, if I scrape my memory. We started following the work of the American scientist Tetlock, who'd written a wonderful book called Super Forecasters, which is a great read for anybody interested in forecasting. And we attended the Tetlock workshop, and then we came back and we sat in a dark room and tried to figure out how we could improve scouts' forecasting abilities. We did an internal pilot project first, which was a fun field prediction league on some of the outcomes of the season, right? You know,
yeah.
How many away wins will team X get this year? Who will be the top scorer? And then you understand how to build the component parts of a forecast, and you start to understand what's external knowledge you have, what's the internal knowledge you have that can inform it. But one of the most important aspects of the forecasting skill was to understand that you're allowed to change your forecast. When new information comes in, you're allowed to change the forecast. And I think football's such a game of opinions, and people feel they have to be firm in their opinions, was one of my learnings in the early years, that you had to stick to your opinion and bang the desk and say, yeah, I know Duncan's going to be a top player. But we learned over time by educating ourselves and reading that you're okay to change your opinion, because the dynamics of the sport dictate that players' careers fluctuate. So if a player has an injury, as we spoke of earlier, I might adjust my forecast of how important he's going to be when he comes into our team. In fact, that one piece of information might see me forecast he's actually not viable for us as an acquisition at this particular point. So we developed a range of questions, and we did this really deeply. We developed a range of questions that scouts would be asked when they were assessing a player, and the questions were age specific, and we did it from under 9 all the way to senior team. And there were questions that would help and guide the scout to make an objective forecast of a player's suitability going forward. And that was supplemented by understanding what it took to be at that level. So you would have to go off and research all the data over many, many seasons that would dictate what a Chelsea central midfielder looks like. So Chelsea are, let's say, top 4 of the Premier League every single season, quarterfinals of the Champions League. Okay, so what are the data points, position by position, that underpin achieving those performance objectives every single year? And where are the population of players that fit that threshold? And then how likely are they to perform that task for your team over the length of their contract for Chelsea? And that was the forecast we were trying to make.
This is a first for the Transfers podcast, but we're going to break our interview with Scott McLachlan into 2 parts. We'll be back with more stories from the world of recruitment, the transfer market, and an insight into the practicalities, problems and advantages of multi-club ownership tomorrow. You've been listening to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com. If you liked what you heard, please follow us on your favourite podcast platform and give us a rating or a review. Your support helps build a bigger audience and therefore bring you more news, analysis and insight. You can also follow and message us on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Transfers Podcast. Our Twitter address is at TransfersCast, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Duncan Castles. Our music and production is by Mark Caulfield at Pro Podcast Production. Stay safe, be well, and thank you as always for listening.